I'd like to invite you to pray with me, please. O God, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations in all of our hearts might be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. One commentator, writing in response to today's gospel lesson, declares that perhaps it is time that we learned new table manners. Perhaps it is time that we learned new table manners. We'll come back to the gospel lesson and this commentator's suggestion in a few moments. But first, I want to invite us to look towards our psalm assigned for today. When we hear the writer of today's psalm, Psalm 112, say that happy are those who fear the Lord, who greatly delight in God's commandments, we should remember that, though it might be less poetic and would not help the flow of this verse, the word fear might better be translated as to be in awe of. To be in awe of. Happy are those who are in awe of the Lord, who greatly delight in God's commandments. The phrase to be in awe of might evoke images of the beauty of the rising and setting of the sun, with all of its magnificent textures of changing colors, or the experience of walking into a cathedral, or even a smaller and more humble church like this one, and finding ourselves taking a quick in-breath as we are startled by the beauty of the sanctuary, or the warmth and joy of community present, or the quiet, difficult-to-describe sense of the holy presence of God. Meanwhile, the word fear evokes quite different pictures and feelings, doesn't it? Perhaps being startled from sleep by a nightmare, or a large, fierce, barking dog, the feeling of that. I had that happen not long ago. Remind me if you want to hear it to tell you that story. Or an angry mob out for destruction and no good. Yes, with this one phrase changed, Psalm 112 lands quite differently, really, for us as listeners and readers. For now, with this one phrase change, it is our awe and wonder at God's marvelousness. Awe and wonder at what we understand as Christians to be God's faithfulness, freely given grace and mercy, not fear, that inspires our efforts to be righteous. That is to say, to live well and in ways that reflect God's goodness for all to see. No wonder the psalmist describes the righteous, those who live in awe of God, as those who rise in the darkness as a light, and as those who deal generously and lend, give to the poor, and perhaps most poignantly for those of us who are all too aware of what we fear in our own lives and this world around us, those who are in awe of God's goodness and who are striving as a result to live rightly or righteously, find that their hearts are firm, secure in the Lord. Their hearts are steady. They will not be afraid, for they know that in the end they will look with triumph on their foes. In the end, it is God's goodness that will triumph, not the things we fear. Over 140 years ago, back in 1882, the first Labor Day parade was held in New York City, and President Grover Cleveland would sign into law the annual celebration of Labor Day on the first Monday of September in 1894. As a conciliatory gesture, I learned, amidst what is now known as the Pullman strike, where over 100,000 railroad workers across the country walked out of their jobs in a growing protest against the Pullman Palace Car Company, which produced railroad cars, and who had cut already low wages for their workers while not reducing the costs of rent and food that they charged in the Pullman Company town where these workers and their families lived. The result for these people who worked 16-hour days was their families facing starvation, as the company was keeping its profits intact and in fact growing. I'm sorry to report that instead of a happy ending to these collective efforts to change the oppressive corporate decisions that were literally starving people and their families, President Cleveland sent in federal troops, thereby escalating tensions and causing needless violence, even as he ironically signed Labor Day into law, a day to recognize the dignity and worth of all those who labor, who work, whose work make possible the day-to-day quality of life for all of us living in the United States. Many folks believe that the recent ways the federal forces have been sent into various situations has only escalated, not helped, those who most need help in those situations in our present-day nation. It's interesting how history seems to repeat itself in one variation or another, isn't it? Perhaps that is why those seeking power and self-aggrandizement in any time in history work so hard to rewrite what actually happened or is happening, so as to justify their power-hungry ways that in truth continue to hurt those most vulnerable and least able to speak up for themselves. Think of those Pullman car workers, 16-hour days, families facing starvation as the company's profits grew. Perhaps this is why we as individuals, even with the best of intentions, can end up living in denial about the consequences of our own actions and choices, than having to face ways that our choices and actions, my choices and actions, may have contributed to the hurts and even horrors that others suffer. As our nation, a nation that I dearly love and long to see better live up to the ideals we proclaim to pursue, as our nation comes to celebrate Labor Day tomorrow, we must reckon with how far we need to go and how much work we need to do to grow in continuing to build fair and equitable work situations for all people, be they the custodians and teachers in our schools, or farmers and migrant workers in the fields, or the people stitching together our clothing or assembling various gadgets and gizmos in far-off countries to satiate our seemingly never-ending thirst for things. And into the midst of this history lesson just shared, and reconsideration of a single phrase in the psalm appointed for today, into the midst of our struggles to live lives from a place of faith, not fear, into the midst of our deep humanness with all of its capacity for the gory and the glory, into the midst of all this and more comes Jesus. Jesus, who was at the house of one of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath. And when Jesus sees the people gathered for this meal, vying for the places of greatest honor at the dinner table, Jesus tells them about another banquet as part of a parable, a teaching story that in this instance cautions us to seek after humility, not human vainglory. One commentator writing about this parable says that these are liberating words that can free us from the necessity of succeeding in our culture's contests of power and esteem. They free us from the over-under relationships and the attitudes and barriers they create, so that we may be free to create human community and enjoy the security of God's grace. So that we may be free to create human community and enjoy the security of God's grace. Can you join me in imagining a world where we as people focus on creating communities where there is a noticeable lack of over-under relationships and power dynamics? Can you join me in imagining a world where people of Christian faith and all different faiths build lives and decisions not out of fear, be it for God or anything else? Where people of faith build lives and decisions not out of faith, but from a place of faith, not out of fear, but from a place of faith that includes awe and wonder for the God of grace, who we as Christians understand to have sent Jesus to break open the bonds of oppression. Break open the bonds of oppression that cause us to oppress one another. Who sent Jesus to make possible the reconciliation of a world that forgets how much love and goodness there is to share. And that when we cease to fight one another for the best places at the banquet table, we can instead begin to discover and learn just how fully that banquet table has been set, with enough for all to share, with no one person above another. Indeed, perhaps it is time for us as individuals, for this nation, and for the world to learn new table manners. Amen.